All right, I guess we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome. Thanks for joining the University of Colorado Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel. It's titled Targeting the Long Game, Athletes and Activism. We'd like to thank our donors and sponsors, without whom events like today's discussion would not be possible. We'd like to thank our speakers for volunteering their time to join us today. I will tell you that it's 2020 and we're on Zoom, and we've been unable to connect so far with Nick Ford, who's going to join the panel. So I've messaged him and said, join in if you can. So if you see his face pop up, that's hopefully will be good news. But until he does, we're really lucky to have two observers and participants in the sports world joining us today for this panel. Nancy Armour, who's a columnist and reporter for USA Today, and before that with AP, based out of Chicago. And Becca Rue, who is the executive director of the US Women's National Team Players Association. And they're going to have a chance to introduce themselves in a second. I would encourage everybody who's watching to take advantage of the chance to submit questions. You can submit questions at any time. And then after we have a conversation, we'll turn things over to your questions, which can be posed directly to either of our panelists now or just in general. And we'll get to those shortly. So before we jump into the topics, I've asked Nancy and Becca to take a moment just to introduce themselves and what they do and what they see, and then we'll get right into it. So Nancy, why don't you start? Don't forget your mute.
Yep. I wasn't sure if you were doing that or if I was doing that. First of all, thank you for having me. As Roger said, I am a columnist for USA Today Sports and have been so since 2014. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years or so with the Associated Press. In my job now, I write about a little bit of everything, but one of the things that I am most interested in is the intersection of sports and society. And in recent years, it's obviously involved a lot of work on social justice issues, gender discrimination, racial equity. And clearly in the last couple of months, there has been no shortage of any of that. So it's an issue I think we need to be talking about. I don't think that the sticking to sports ever really existed, but even more so now. We can't afford to do that.
Becca?
Am I on?
You are.
Great. As Roger said, I'm the executive director of the US Women's National Team Players Association, which I know is quite a mouthful. Prior to that, I was at McKinsey as a consultant after getting my JD MBA at Kellogg and Northwestern. And I've been in this job for about 3.5 years. I say it has three parts. One is simply just being a labor union. If you're not familiar with the labor union, our main function is it's a membership organization, which means the players are my bosses, and we have different types of committees and boards, and we run just like any other organization, manage a budget, et cetera. But the bigger part is negotiating a collective bargaining agreement and enforcing that collective bargaining agreement. And the other two parts of the job are one, as we say, impact. That extends to women's soccer and society, is how we are collectively having an impact across those two spheres. And then the third is commercial. So we do a lot within the commercial space. As you can see behind me, I have a Wheaties box and some playing cards. Those are part of our licensing activities that we have really picked up in the last few years. And I think similar to what Nancy said, athletes, there's never been such thing as stick to sports. Athletes are humans, and they represent every part of humans, from the flaws to those that get discriminated against. And therefore they have a role in helping not only be activists for themselves, but also for a broader society. Really looking forward to the discussion, Roger.
Great, thanks for being here. So a note from the technical folks says, if you were having trouble on YouTube watching, refresh your screen, see if that helps. All right, Nancy, I'm going to jump right to you. And so we're in a strange time, obviously. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You turn on the TV, you see the Kentucky Derby. you see NBA playoffs, you don't see football.
You will
just,
tonight.
all right, it's coming. Yeah, and so I guess I wanted to get a sense from you as to kind of what's going on. Where are we at in the entire sports world at this moment, and what makes it such fertile ground for activism, or does it?
Well, it absolutely does. But going back to what you said about where are we, I think when all of this started, when the league shut down in March, the NBA was the first to go. NCAA quickly followed, canceling the men's and women's basketball tournaments, their other spring championships. The NHL and MLB actually, joined in. And I think at that point, a lot of us thought we weren't getting our sports back anytime soon. Possibly not without a vaccine. And the leagues, and let's be honest, it's been driven by money, because they would lose billions and billions of dollars if they did not play this season or if they did not resume their seasons. They were determined to find a way to figure it out. So we've seen different things. The NWSL, Major League Soccer, NBA, WNBA have all played in bubbles, and we see that those work. In all four of those tournaments, since the players got to their bubbles and went through the acclimation period, there have been no positive tests, which is stunning. When you consider the number of people who are involved, the fact that they have been able to maintain that bubble is truly impressive. We've seen with other sports, Major League Baseball, once they started traveling, they couldn't maintain their bubble, whether it is the hotels, players getting bored and going out, just interaction with general people. They struggled a bit more. The NFL has also done actually a phenomenal job. I thought that there was absolutely no way we could have a contact sport, 53-man roster, dozens of coaches. There'd be no way that this could work. But we're seeing with daily testing, rapid test results, and a very strict protocol. Basically, you go from home to the facility and back, and that's it. They're finding a way to make it happen. College sports, not so much, but it's because you have you cannot put college football players or college athletes in a bubble unless you want to take them off campus or shut down the rest of the campus. And that brings up a whole host of other things that I'm sure that we will get into. So, I think it's been really interesting to watch and see how the leagues have adapted. Obviously some better than others, but I think we're all incredibly grateful. At least I know I am, that they are undertaking this, because not only is it giving us some sense of normalcy and a distraction, it's also giving us some ideas about how we can handle it, how we can handle this. What can companies do if they want to come back? What should we be doing with schools? Are we following that? Not necessarily, but there are some guidelines here that can apply to general society as a whole, and I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. So the follow-up question is what makes this moment, how did we get from Colin Kaepernick kneeling basically alone to where we are now, where we're seeing a remarkable array of activism across sport, from college sport to pro sport, internationally and so on. So how did we get here? What is it that's brought us to this moment?
I think it's been somewhat of a perfect storm. And, we did see other athletes joining in. Becca can talk about what the women's soccer players have done. The WNBA has been a leader in social justice activism for years and years and years. But I think, unfortunately, the death of George Floyd really, and I say unfortunate, his death was unfortunate, but fortunate for us as a society, it really woke a lot of white people up to the fact that that existence is different for Black and brown people, that the system is rigged in every aspect against people of color. And you saw that playing out in real time in that horrific video. And, athletes, as Becca said, they're human. They don't look at George Floyd and see this man that they don't know. They see their brothers, they see their fathers, they see their husbands, they see themselves. And so I think as much as the entire country was shocked into action by this, it went double, even more so for athletes. And then you have the fact that they're not able to do they're not able to live their normal lives. They're, for the NBA players, they have practice and games, and that's it in the bubble. And so as my colleague Jeff Zilgett wrote, the NBA could protect against the coronavirus. It couldn't protect the players from the other virus, which is racism. So when you have these players who have, frankly, not a whole lot else to do, they're looking at ways that they can make changes, and they're seeing and absorbing these images, these other instances of discrimination and violence against people of color. And they're feeling it probably more deeply than they would have if they had been, on their summer vacations or, in training camps or whatever it is. And you know what? I personally think it's a great thing because it needed to happen.
Becca, I'd like to turn to you, and could you give a kind of a brief overview of the journey that the women's national team has been on in terms of activism? I think many people will be aware of the issue of equal pay, but it's been in play, I guess, for years now, and just kind of let people know where we're at and how that's going still.
Absolutely. I'll just first say there's many types of activism and there's many issues around which we should be activists, and equal pay is just one small one. I think the US Women's National Team, I grew up as a fan. I loved the 1996 Olympic team and the 1999 World Cup team, who both came out victorious in the first major world tournaments in women's soccer ever. And those women, Julie Foudy, Mia Hamm, Michelle Akers, Brianna Scurry, they set the tone for what is really the culture that embodies this team. And I'm just really fortunate to, my role is as an activist behind the scenes. So I help set them up, but really it's so ingrained in who they are and their DNA of this team. And it's not just pay equity, gender equity, sexual orientation, but thankfully we're all talking more and more explicitly about race and gender identity and trans issues. And so where it starts or what the journey is, it starts at the very beginning. And I think that's true of women's sports generally, because we've always had to fight, or athletes of color have had to fight. And so the short synopsis is 1985, the US Women's National Team starts. And since then, they have been fighting on different fronts for various types of equality and against different types of discrimination. Are you wanting a more up-to-date or more recent account, or what is helpful?
Well, we'll get there. Okay. But I guess one thing, and I think this would be helpful for the audience, is could you describe what the U.S. Women's National Team actually is?
Yeah.
Is it like Chelsea or Manchester United or the New York Yankees, or I mean, how should people understand what it actually is?
In soccer, players play for club and country. So Manchester United and Chelsea and the US MLS teams, or for the women's side, NWSL teams, that's all club. NWSL's National Women's Soccer League. That's our professional women's soccer league in the US. And then country is playing in the World Cup or the Olympics. And it's kind of like the dream team on men's basketball or women's basketball. But they play, I think in soccer, it is just a more frequent cadence. So yes, there's a World Cup every 4 years. There's the Olympics every 4 years, but they do have other events and games throughout the 4-year cycles.
So I think everyone is familiar with the fact that in our society, women are often not compensated at the level of their male peers. But how did this become an issue in soccer? I mean, they both sit under the same Olympic governing body. How did they get off on the wrong track to begin with? And where are things right now in September 2020?
Yes, they have the same employer, which is different and unique from the WNBA and NBA. So, and the US Soccer is the employer for both the US Men's National Team and US Women's National Team. And that's the same for every national team, period. There's one national governing body that oversees the sport regardless of gender. I think I'll give a plug for Caitlin Murray's book, which is sitting behind me. If you really want to know a lot of ins and outs, I would read this, but it starts with the very beginning. I mean, women's sports in soccer specifically, England banned and made illegal for 50 years from 1921 to 1971, the sport of soccer. So then we have Title IX, we start the US Women's National Team in 1985. We get a head start on some of the rest of the world, not just in soccer, but in many sports and women. But still, even with the legislation, you need a culture change. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing right now is that culture shift. And I really believe that's where athletes have a huge role to play in helping advance society. Is you have to see it to believe it, but we are fighting generations of stereotypes and unconscious bias and explicit bias, frankly. And the women experience explicit bias from the very beginning. Even in the 1996 Olympics, the women were going to only get a bonus if they won gold medal. And it was going to be less than if the men won a gold medal. So this has just been from the very beginning, and hopefully that changes soon.
Great. Nancy, could you talk a little bit about why it is that the women's side of sports seems to have been out in front? I mean, if you go back to Billie Jean King, through Venus Williams in tennis, advocating for equal pay in that sport, and you mentioned the WNBA has a long history of activism. Is that just a common across sports that we see a longer history of this type of activism, as compared to, say, the NFL, for example, and college sports?
I think it's, Becca touched on this, and we did a podcast where we had Nneka Ogwumike, who is the head of the WNBA Players Association. She's also a forward for the Los Angeles Sparks. And she put it really succinctly. She said, we are a league that is majority minority. It is probably 70%, 80% Black women. It has a large population of LGBTQ community, and they're women. So, it's basically your entire existence has been to be marginalized and discriminated against. So when that happens, of course, you're going to want to address that and change that. And so, I think it comes naturally to us because as women, we've had to fight for equality, whether it's the right to vote, whether it's Title IX, whether it is the gap in pay that exists in every single industry that there is. Women are still trying to narrow that gap. So activism, we term it activism, but it's basically just real life for these athletes. And they recognize that they have a platform and a way to speak out and challenge the structure. And so they're going to use that. And then that filters over into other aspects of society.
That's great. Becca, we don't have our athlete representative joining the panel today, so I'm going to ask you two questions, because you're up close and personal with some of the most famous activists in the world, like Megan Rapinoe. And in our conversation earlier, before we came online, you said that you're not the athlete activist, you work for them. But what's it like for these athletes being in the spotlight? What's it like being the subject of a Trump tweet, or getting online abuse all the time, or just being a public figure, not just because of what you can do on the pitch, but for who you are and what you represent? What do you see, and what are your conversations like with these athletes as someone who's involved in helping them govern their sport?
I do wish Nick could join so he could talk about this first person. So I will just say I will not do this justice to talk about how they feel or what it is to experience, but I can say what I observe, at least. These women have multiple jobs. I mean, not only are they some of the best players in the world and they have to work at their own craft, but they also are influencers because we expect them to make much of their money from sponsorship deals. And then on top of that, we ask them to change the entire systemic discrimination that they face on a daily basis, not only for themselves, but potentially for beyond themselves. And so they're just incredible. I mean, Megan Rapinoe, you mentioned her name. She is a remarkable communicator. She does really well what WNBA players do as well. Nneka is so eloquent. They just know how to turn any interview opportunity that they have into something that's more than just about the game that they just played, the great play that they made, or whatever is happening with what a coach said or something. It's always about a bigger message, and it's not even something that they really have to taking a ton of effort on. Like Megan isn't studying her talking points before she goes into a locker room. It's just ingrained in what she does and what she says on a daily basis. Becky Sauerbrunn is incredible. And really, I think everybody has a different role, even within our group. And some are more out front, more media requests and play that role well. And others are grinding it out behind the scenes. And it's work. I mean, that was one of my greatest takeaways. And I'm sure Terry Smith, Terry Jackson, my counterpart over at the WNBA Players Association, can speak about this with her players as well. We do work with them. Like they dig in. It is not only it's understanding what the issues are, but then how do we address them and what are some potential downside ramifications or other impacts that we're not considering that we need to take into place. And I think what I would say is sometimes I'm just tired for them. That's how I would put it. Like I look at some of them even now having to deal with COVID and where we are as a society and ongoing behind the scenes issues, whether it's CBA related or lawsuit related in our case. And it's a lot. It would be a luxury to be an athlete that just gets to be an athlete. Like how wonderful would that be? And I hope one day that they get to experience that. But these athletes have taken it on themselves to do much more.
Let me follow that up. And then before I do, let me remind you to submit your questions. And in a little bit, we'll turn to your audience questions. Submit them at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Becca, how do you handle, and then Nancy, I'll follow up with you more generally, but how do you handle, or how do the athletes handle and their coaches conflict? Because some are very comfortable advocating for certain things, but you know, athletes are people, and there's a diversity of views on politics and social justice and so on. How does a team function that has to have sporting success at the same time? You know, a lot of them are out advocating for things that maybe not everybody believes in and so on. How do those dynamics actually work on a high level team?
On a high level team, I mean, I think there's just a lot of discussions, and we have a fortunate situation where sometimes there's just 23 players on a roster. And so you can have, everybody gets in a locker room. And even we talked about the beginning of COVID, I was at the game on March 11th in Dallas. And that was right after US Soccer's most recent lawsuit filing, which wasn't frankly a surprise to me what the language said, but it had a lot of fireworks came out of it. And the players just before the game decided to turn their shirts inside out as a form of protest. And I think that looks like a phone call to me and our labor lawyers just to check before they do that. But then it's a conversation with them in the locker room just before the game and with their coach to make sure he had a heads up. And I guarantee you not every player would have done that on their own without the strength of their teammates together with them. And so sometimes maybe that looks like pulling teammates along or helping pave a way for them. And that's, I think, as true as you look across various leagues. Like WNBA is majority minority. I mean, they are lockstep, man. They are just a force to be reckoned with, and they have done it so well. And that's not necessarily true in leagues where they're not majority minority, which is frankly no other league, really. Even in WSL, we have, at least on the racism standpoint, we are nowhere near 70% Black women. So it is about educating your own teammates and helping them feel comfortable, and also probably having really powerful voices like Megan Rapinoe, Becky Sauerbrunn in the locker room that help pave that way.
Yeah, and for anyone who is not aware of the fireworks that Becca refers to, when U.S. Soccer filed a briefing, a filing in the equal pay lawsuit, they happened to justify paying women less on the argument that they are not as good at athletes. That's my characterization of what they said. Not as good at athletes as the men. So of course, obviously, they should get paid less, which didn't go over very well, and it was quickly remedied by U.S. Soccer. Nancy, so going back to Jackie Robinson and so on, I mean, the sports community has never been of one voice. And we see this all the way up to today, like with college football. We have the Big Ten and Pac-12 football players mobilizing, and then almost immediately we had a reaction from athletes in the Southeastern Conference, an ACC, saying we want to play. So how do you observe kind of the internal to sport dynamics when it comes to activism? How well does the sports community deal with this across the different professional and college landscapes?
I think overall remarkably well when you do consider, some of the sizes of these rosters. As you said, not everybody is going to agree. You've got people from very different backgrounds, from very different experiences. I think it's easier when it's an issue that affects everybody on a team, like for the US Women's National Team, they're all feeling the effects of not being paid the same as their male counterparts. So that's and when I say easy, I mean in terms of getting agreement that people will agree to say, yeah, this is not right, and we'd like to do something about it. Then, it's a different conversation on what that is. But when you have something that doesn't impact everybody, it can be a much tougher sell, or it can be lonely for some athletes. And we saw that in the NFL when Colin Kaepernick began protesting. Eric Reed, his teammate on the 49ers, joined him, but really for several weeks, that was it. You had some other athletes slowly join in, most of whom were Black players. There was Chris Long who's white, would stand with his Philadelphia Eagles teammates and usually put his hand on their shoulders, but you didn't see a lot of white athletes demonstrating. And I think, unfortunately, that allowed people to turn away or to disregard the protests. And that's one thing we've seen in recent months is a lot of white NFL players have said, you know what, I'm going to protest, or this is not right. I stand with my teammates. And that makes an impact. But I think what it is if you do have one of those lone voices, first of all, and it takes an incredible amount of strength of character, but we heard that Kaepernick had discussions with his teammates in the 49ers locker room and explained to them the reasons for his protest. He explained why he was doing this. And so those are conversations that, maybe they don't change minds, but they can at least make people see where you're coming from. And I think that is one of the great benefits of sports, is that these athletes are used to having to put aside their differences for a common goal, whether that is your play on the field or what you're doing off the field in terms of raising awareness on an issue.
So can you talk a little bit about what's happened with the NFL, and maybe in particular the Washington football team, as it's called? That there has been calls for as long as I can remember, for the Washington Redskins, as they were formerly known, to get rid of their racist name, and it happened. Despite the opposition of the ownership and so on. I mean, is this part of the fallout you mentioned after the death of George Floyd? Is this, what accounts for the NFL had a pretty strong wall up against Colin Kaepernick, even Donald Trump weighed in and so on, but that wall has crumbled, it seems, in some respects. What accounts for the NFL all of a sudden joining the NBA and becoming more, I wouldn't go so far as to call it an activist league, but it's certainly a different landscape than 1 year ago today.
Yes. I think in the case of the Washington football team, it's very simple: money. I think if Daniel Snyder had his way, the name and the logo would continue to be the racist name and logo that it had been for generations. But we are at a fascinating time in history. And it's, this is 30, 40 years ago, 30 or 40 years from now, we're going to look back at this the way that we do now at the civil rights movement of the 60s. And companies don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You look at what Nike did with Colin Kaepernick 2 years ago when they signed him to a pretty significant sponsorship deal, despite the fact that he wasn't in the NFL. They recognized that, particularly in the younger demographic, people realized that what he was doing was righteous and good, and that in the future, he will be looked at like a a John Carlos and a Tommy Smith, a Billie Jean King, somebody who, Muhammad Ali, somebody who sacrificed themselves for the greater good. And so you had these sponsors of the Washington football team seeing what was happening this summer, seeing the protests that were taking place throughout the country, watching Black Lives Matter being painted on a plaza in Washington, D.C., and said, you know what? I don't want to be associated with a dinosaur, a racist, somebody who clings to these racist tropes in 2020. And they basically forced Daniel Snyder's hand. Now, the NFL in general, I think had Roger Goodell been able to make decisions on his own, I think we would have seen the NFL do things differently. But you have 32 owners, the majority of whom are older white men who either didn't get the protest movement or were completely in opposition to it. But they too are seeing things change. And some of the owners have been really kind of eloquent in the last, I'd say, week or so in speaking about why they support their players' right to protest. And several of them have said, I didn't understand. I didn't know my players' experience. Now, you can question why it took them so long. But the point is, they're listening in a different way. They're seeing things in a different way. And nobody wants to be looked at as, like I said, a dinosaur. In 40 years, they don't want to be seen as somebody who was ignorant, racist, or bigoted. They want to be seen as participating in this sea change in our country.
Just a quick note to the organizers. I just got a message by Nick Ford, so hopefully you can get him online here and join us, because I do want to turn to college sports. So Nancy, eventually, I'm going to assume we're going to go back to some semblance of normal at some point in the future. Let's hope, right? What do you see as happening in particularly, NFL, NBA, WNBA? Is this moment a pandemic moment, or is the landscape of sport changed forever? What do you see happening in 2021, 2022, and so on?
I think it's changed forever. This is not a genie that you can put back in a bottle, and nor should we. And what I found the most interesting and the most fascinating is, when you look at the NFL, you look at the faces of this next generation. You have Patrick Mahomes, you have Deshaun Watson, who were part of that very powerful video that basically forced Roger Goodell to come out and say, we support you. We should have done this earlier. I apologize. But you also have people like Baker Mayfield, Joey Burrow, who was the #1 draft pick, saying, what this country has done is not right. I stand with my Black teammates. It won't surprise me. Baker Mayfield has already said he's going to kneel. It won't surprise me if Joey Burrow does something similar. Trevor Lawrence at Clemson has already shown that he's an ally. So I think you're going to see athletes speaking up more, using their platforms more. And when people tell them to stick to sports, not listening to it and responding and saying, no, that's, I'm an athlete, but I'm also human, and I'm going to use my platform in the way that I best see fit.
Becca, what's next for the women's national team? Where do they go in their next stage? They haven't fully won, I guess, their equal pay fight yet. What happens next?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of Nancy, I think there's so many things going on in addition to equal pay, and so this won't just for US Women's national team, and I think their NWSL teammates, or now for those that have gone over to Europe, their Man City or Man United teammates. I hope that we are continuing to push the conversation for pay equity specifically. The lawsuit is still ongoing, and it is still at the lower court in California. There are still some outstanding issues that the judge did not yet rule on, and the players have indicated after those issues have gone through the process that they need to go through at the lower court, they will appeal to an upper court. And then as a labor union, we have a collective bargaining agreement that's expiring at the end of 2021. And so there will be I see that as a two-pronged approach to achieving a goal that I think is in our sights, to achieve equal pay. And for the players to achieve it is one thing. I think really, and even our own time and efforts have been spent on not just ourselves, but others. It is really about what is happening in a broader society, and have teamed up a lot with Time's Up and their Time's Up Pay Up initiative, and helping push various legislation or policies, both at local, state, and federal levels, but also as we approach an election, working with Luna Bar right now on who are the candidates that are even for some of those various policies that experts say will help close the gap for women around society in various industries.
So US Soccer, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they had a prohibition against taking a knee, right, in national team matches at one point. Do they still have that?
They had a bylaw that they passed in the beginning of 2017, so early March 2017, that said that all athletes should stand respectfully. As a labor union, we never agreed that bylaw would apply to our players, and nor did the US men's national team. I think shortly after Colin Kaepernick began kneeling, Megan Rapinoe began kneeling first in her National Women's Soccer League games for her team up in Tacoma now, the OL Reign, and then she later did it for a US women's national team. So the membership of US Soccer, which looks mostly white and mostly male, did pass a bylaw that said that earlier this year, and largely in response to George Floyd, and I think similar with the Washington football team. This was seen as something that was just not okay. And money does drive a lot. Earlier when we talked about the fireworks that happened at March 11th, you said that US Soccer remedied it. I don't know if I would say that they remedied it. I think their sponsors remedied it for them. And there was such a backlash. And that's where I say culture comes in as such a role, because it's a good business decision at this point to be anti-racist. It is awful that we had to get to that point, and it can't just be true on moral and ethical grounds and as humans. But that, unfortunately, is part of what has to force change, and sponsors play a big role in that, and how we need to see that change come about.
Do you think that rule was targeted specific at Megan Rapinoe?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a really strange situation to have your governing body target an individual athlete. And, we saw that with NFL and Colin Kaepernick, and we've seen that in other sports before, but it's a remarkable statement about where we are. I do want to I don't see Nick showing up yet, and I don't see a message from him, so he's not getting in. But I do want to, before I start answering questions, which are starting to pile up, keep sending them. I do want to talk a bit about college sports. And Nancy, I've been teaching sports governance classes for a while now, and the literature on athlete compensation in big time programs, particularly men's football and basketball, and increasingly women's basketball, it goes back 30, 40, 50 years. Do you think that things are changing? We have name, image, likeness rules that are soon to come into play. Athletes have probably more power today than ever, not just because of the social justice causes, but they're recognizing because of the pandemic. They are the economic engine that drives big programs like at Colorado and elsewhere. Do you see activism in college sports? Are we at the beginning of something? Are we in the middle of something? Where are we at with that?
I would say probably the beginning. And part of that is, I think you were right. I think the pandemic has made college athletes recognize, I think they always knew that they were the people making the money for these universities, but I think that they have more recognized the power that gives them. The challenge with college athletics is you have so many different variations of it. You have a big time, Alabama is essentially an NFL team, basically. That's much different than, say, a Division III program, or even a small Division I program, or football bowl championship, whatever we're calling them these days. So, you have different needs, you have different, different possibilities. And with college sports, there's not a union. That's one of the big things with all of the professional sports is there is strength in numbers, and you have power when you have, whether it's bargaining for a contract, bargaining over, COVID protocols, all of those things. And college sports don't have that. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of months is when you have a Trevor Lawrence taking the lead on these things, when you have all of the Pac-12 athletes getting together and saying, we want this or else, that makes an impression. And, if the NCAA and the member institutions don't look at this and recognize that they're going to have to do something to address this, or, bring players in and make them, if not equal participants, then pretty close to it, there will be a reckoning. And yeah, like I said, I think we're at the start of it, but I think it's, similar to activism in at the professional level. This is a genie you cannot put back in the bottle. The landscape has changed, and it's not going back.
So if you take a look at professional sports around the world, and maybe U.S. men's and women's soccer might be one of the exceptions, but in a round number, from the revenues that any professional league gets, about half of it, plus or minus, goes to the athletes. And if you take the NCAA and you add up all the scholarships and cost of attendance and food and so on, about 15% is devoted to the athletes. Where do you think that's going to end up? Do you think that the athlete power is such that they're going to be able to redirect 50%? And let me say, people can contact me. There's a recent paper came out last week that looked at the economics of college sports and said, yeah, it would be possible. Coaches' salaries would go down, facility spending would go down. But if the NFL can do it, and the NBA can do it, and the Bundesliga can do it, so too can the NCAA. Do you see a radical reshift in how college sports economics is going to run?
I think it's coming. I think people are looking at the fact that you've got, a strength coach who's making more than $1 million at a college program, and you've got athletes who are not getting anything over, as of right now, over the real cost of their education. That's just not equitable. And I think one thing that, like I said, these last couple months have shown us is that our priorities need to shift. And if you want to have college athletics, if you want to have something that's not just a feeder system for the professional levels, you're going to have to change the structure. And, some of the Taj Mahals that universities have built, there's no need for them. Not if these truly are student athletes. And that's, those programs or facilities like that kind of, they reveal the lie that there's been when you have an academic, a quote unquote academic center for only for athletes. When you have, a locker room or facility that is nicer than any gym in any part of the country, these aren't typical student athletes. They are quasi-professional athletes. And at some point you're going to have to recognize that in with finances.
This is probably an unfair question, and Beck, I'll come to you with the same one. And we just saw, in what was in effect a work stoppage by athletes in the last couple of weeks after the latest killing of an unarmed Black man by police. Do you see, and you hear about this increasingly when the NCAA tournament comes around and so on. Do you think it'll ever get to the point where college athletes will join together and walk off the court or walk off the field and say, we have the power? And I know, and Becca, I'll come to you next. I know the women's national team has at least there's been rumors or stirrings of boycotts like that, but do you foresee getting to that point?
I think it's hard to say that across the board, simply because of what we talked about before, that you have people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different wants and needs. But one thing that was telling was seeing the number of big time programs that had their own demonstrations. I mean, Alabama marched to, was it a courthouse or a school that had once been segregated? I mean, that was an incredibly powerful image. And you saw that across the SEC. You saw that at some of the, biggest names in college sports, and you had Nick Saban marching not only with his athletes, but at the very front of them. You have Roy Williams making one of the first videos with his athletes saying no more. So I don't know that we'll ever see a nationwide work stoppage, but if things are not addressed, yeah, I could see it at individual schools. We almost had it in Missouri a couple of years ago. So there's no reason that it couldn't happen. And I think, like I said, for athletes, this is personal. The Black and brown athletes, as they will tell you often, when they take off their uniforms, they are still Black men and women. They all have their own stories, whether it's themselves, their family members, of being stopped and harassed by police. And I think their white teammates hearing those stories and seeing the pain that these athletes have encountered, it changes things. And so if society doesn't take some steps, yeah, I think you could see athletes saying, we know we have this power and this is the best way we know to use it.
Yeah, and just to expand on the Missouri case you cited in 2015, that was probably responsible for the resignation of the president of the university when the football team threatened to strike or not play. Becca, what have the conversations been, to the extent you can reveal them, among the women's national team about going to such extreme lengths? What are the trade-offs there, and do you foresee that as happening in your sport?
There have been strikes or work stoppages for the women's national team in the past. We haven't, I think most recently it was probably 2005. And that was both kind of a combination of a lockout and somewhat of a strike. But it isn't, I think we've seen it in other nations, that Brazil and who in theory says they achieve some sort of pay equity, though I still have questions about the details of that. But you've seen it in other countries. Spain was on a strike in their women's league. I think a work stoppage is a very, as you said, extreme measure. And so in college sports, that's a very fractured landscape of athletes across sports. As Nancy said, very different backgrounds, but very different incentive structures for each of them. And they also have one-year scholarships. And those one-year scholarships are not guaranteed. And so I think you have to always consider what are the societal forces. And for the players that boycotted, I think the unions would all say that was not a work stoppage a couple of weeks ago. That was a boycott that the leagues were okay with. It is an effective way of getting attention. And they did, I mean, it is in such an inspiring and I think historical moment. For the women's national team, there's always going to be a lot. We are in a different place than I think some of those other countries who went on strike, or even it's a very different situation than what we just saw a couple of weeks ago. For the women's national team to go on strike, or for college athletes to go on strike, it is going to need to be an issue that is extremely big, and you always have to consider the downside ramifications. We have a current CBA, and we did even while we were negotiating last, that there's a no strike clause. And many people said, well, why don't they just strike if they don't like it? Well, it's not that simple. There's always other things you have to take into account. So I know work stoppage is a very extreme measure. I always hope that we can achieve other progress and through other mechanisms. And if we get to that point, then you get to that point, and that's what happens.
I'd also chime in too that a work stoppage is not, it gets a lot of attention, but there are other things that you can do that get an equal amount of attention. And Becca, you mentioned at that game on March 11th, when the players turned their warm-up jerseys inside out, that was an incredible moment. I mean, and if you were following along on social media or watching on TV, that was all of the discussion, was that basically the players were saying, for that point, we don't represent US soccer, or US soccer, we are not part of that. It was an incredible gesture and it was an incredible movement. And I would argue that it probably had as much impact as the players saying we're not taking the field that night, if they would have said that. So it'd be, like you said, based on your financial incentives, what the issues are, et cetera, there are times that other gestures can have just as much impact, can be just as meaningful as an actual work stoppage.
Completely agree.
And Becca, hasn't the top player in Norway refused to play for their team?
Ada Hedeberg, yes.
Yes.
And so there are individual players that can take that decision, and I think that's her own protest. I mean, it's not the same as a work stoppage, because
Right.
playing for your country is something you are electing to do. You can also decide not to play for your country and just do your job as a professional athlete, which we see NBA players do, for instance, that they take their name out of the hat for consideration for playing for the Olympic team. But that's what Ada has done. And she said very explicitly, it's in protest of how she feels the Norwegian Federation treats the women's team versus the men.
Has that been effective, or do you think that?
I don't actually know enough about her individual
Right.
situation or what happened in Norway to comment.
Yep. All right, I'm going to turn to questions, so keep them coming in. We're going to be running out of time here shortly. And this one, Becca, we'll start with you, and I'll just read it. So great to see these amazing women that work to promote social justice issues. Thank you for your work. General question for both women. In this difficult time with so much unknown, can you share a breakthrough moment recently that you have experienced that gives hope things are moving in a positive direction, either from a social justice perspective or from a sports perspective in general? I think all of us are interested in hope things are moving in a positive direction. Becca, we'll start with you. Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'll choose a few moments. I think as I said, I was very inspired by the actions by the players from a couple weeks ago in response to a Black man being shot in the back 7 times by police in a form of police brutality. Like it is a endemic issue within our society, and it is something we have to all open our eyes to. And they made an action that said, hey, you can't look away from this. I think the other one on a maybe slightly different note is more Angel City coming into our league, the National Women's Soccer League. That has been such a validator for a lot of the work that the players have done, that I have done, that you have a bunch of very celebrity women, but also investors and astute business people that are saying, no, we believe in this. And so much of what we talk about with equal pay is but the revenue. And I always say, but the investment. You can't have return on investment without investment. And we finally have incredible people that are like, no, we believe in this. We believe in this as a business, and we're going to invest in it and help realize the potential, because that is where we've seen such a lack of investment in the women's sports world, that has largely led to the revenue gap. It is not a justification for the pay gap, but I'm thankful and inspired by the Angel City group that's come in.
Yeah, and for people who aren't aware, can you describe a little bit what that group is and what they're doing?
Sure. We have a new expansion team in the National Women's Soccer League that has the Los Angeles territory. They have dubbed themselves Angel City for now. It is led largely by a group really with Natalie Portman and a woman who's a venture capitalist named Kara Nortman, and Alexis Ohanian, who's Serena Williams' husband. And Serena and her daughter Olympia are also part of it. They have a roster of like 50 or 60 owners, and it is a long list. It was really fun. This is actually part of my behind the scenes. It was really fun to watch that group to come together. The relationship with Natalie and me and the team really started through Kara, who is a board member for Time's Up, and was largely, even before the lawsuit had been filed, more just about gender equity and pay equity and how can we learn from the entertainment industry. And then Natalie said, oh, you know what, let me get my friends to come and watch you guys play when you're in LA in April of 2019 to support your on the field efforts, because you guys are professional athletes first, and we want to be fans. We are fans, and we want to come and support you. And that included Uzo Abuda, Jessica Chastain, Jen Garner, and Eva Longoria. And all 5 of them that came to that game are part of that initial ownership group. So you have that side where women supporting women, which is always fun. And then you also have Alexis, who's just such a great champion, and a bunch of other astute business people that are all leaning in. So that's it. They should take the field in 2022.
Yeah, that's a great positive story. Before I go to you, Nancy, my pet ID, if you look over my shoulder, this shoulder, there's a stadium here on our campus in Boulder that's it's empty about 350 days a year. And I would think that as college athletic departments start looking to figure out how they're going to make more money going forward, that partnering with women's soccer or even men's soccer to try to get butts in stadiums might be an opportunity for investors going forward that didn't exist before. All right, Nancy, can you share a breakthrough moment recently you've experienced that gives hope things are moving in a positive direction from a social justice perspective or from a sports perspective in general?
I'll do two. I'll echo what Becca said about the work stoppage that was led by the Bucks. I grew up in Milwaukee, and I also went to college there. So I'm very familiar with the endemic racism in Milwaukee and Wisconsin in general. And to watch the Bucks take the lead on that was very powerful and a very proud moment for somebody who's from Milwaukee. And then to see the Brewers chime in on that, because Major League Baseball has plenty of issues and it has not really done a whole lot of, it's not really done any work in terms of social justice in the last couple of years. And to see the Brewers say, we're affected by this, we're going to support our, city brethren, was, like I said, it was powerful. And as somebody who's from Milwaukee, it was pretty inspiring. I'll also point to the comments that Jerry Jones made over the weekend when he basically hinted or indicated that he would not stand in the way of his players protesting. And if you know anything about Jerry, that is just a monumental shift. I mean, he has been one of the most strident owners in terms of shutting down the NFL player protests. He knelt with his players in 2017 after Donald Trump had went after protesting players, but that was basically for show. Jerry's feelings, he'll talk about, oh, we stand for the anthem, we respect the anthem, which I won't even get into the fact that this isn't about the anthem, it's not about the military, whatever. So to hear him say, and even a couple of weeks ago, he basically said he wanted players to do this with grace, and then suggested that they kneel before the anthem and then stand for the anthem. And it's clear, with comments that Dak Prescott made and Ezekiel Elliott made, that his two standout players don't agree with him, don't agree with that philosophy. And Jerry basically had to meet the moment and acknowledge that his players don't agree with him, that they see things differently, and that he might have to see things differently too. And a lot of times as Jerry goes, the rest of the NFL goes too. So if Jerry's going to get on board with the protest movement, and I use get on board very loosely, but if he is not going to push back, it'll be very hard for another owner to say, no, my players can't do this, or there are going to be ramifications for my players. So it was a small thing, and he didn't come right out and say he'd support it, but the fact that he didn't try and impose his will, I think is pretty significant.
That's great. I'll stick with you for this one, Nancy. And I'll kind of reshape this question a little bit, because there's people like Becca who are lawyers, and they're obviously, sorry, Becca, not as famous as Megan Rapinoe or LeBron James. But Nancy, could you talk a little bit about the supporting infrastructure that's behind it? I mean, we see athletes, we see them on TV doing wonderful things, and when they protest or are activists, they have big impact. But behind the scenes in sports organizations, alongside sports organizations, I mean, at the college level, it's really hard for college students. I've learned, they're only around for 4 or 5 years. They don't have expertise. They don't have law degrees. It's really hard for them to advocate. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as kind of, the part of the iceberg that's below the surface in activism?
Social media. That to me has been the biggest game changer in all of this. It used to be that only your marquee player had a platform, or maybe 2 or 3 players, depending upon how big your team was. But now with social media, everybody has a platform, and people are fans of, I don't know if you'd want to call them fringe players or not so well-known players, because of their social media presence, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, TikTok now. And those different platforms have given these athletes a way to be heard, a way to make statements and reach audiences that the team doesn't necessarily, or, you know, don't necessarily have anything to do with their own sport. So to me, that has been the most significant difference, is that, you know, these athletes are no longer reliant on their teams or their sponsors or even their agents to make statements, to develop a presence. They can do it on their own. And quite frankly, they have.
Becca, you work in a world that involves contracts and law and things that people don't see. What's it like being part of that supporting infrastructure for athletes, particularly as they're advocating for change, recognizing that change, you know, doesn't happen simply because somebody calls for it, but we have to change our institutions, our practices, our culture, and so on.
Nancy's right that social media changes everything. And so a lot of times I actually don't have to do much because athletes have their own voice and they are able to put it out. So I'm not going to try to take credit for anything and everything that athletes are or are not doing. I think first I'll say I'm not a lawyer. I have a JD, but I've never practiced law. So I'm thankful to have our legal team and always be able to hand things off to them. And I think whether it's the legal team, me, or other administrators that are working behind the scenes for athletes, this goes down to college and what's happening around NIL and up into professional ranks or over into Olympics. There is a lot of, mostly the people I get to work with, thankfully, are really good people, especially in women's sports. I think there's a lot of really good intentions, and I'm thankful to have the opportunity. I think it is both encouraging to see some of the cracks that we can break in our proverbial glass ceiling, and our athletes are out on the front lines doing that publicly, and there's people behind the scenes privately. I also think it can be, there's some harder days too, where it's just like you're beating your head against a wall. And man, I watched actually Billie Jean King, I watched the Battle of the Sexes as a break from something related to negotiations. I went to that movie and honestly, it was terrible. It was the same things that Billie Jean King heard over 40 years ago, or what we were hearing in the negotiation room. And sports is a reflection of society. I always will believe that, going back to Greek times, and it is both something that can lead the way, but also can largely trail. And when you have billionaire owners that are often who you're on the other side of, at least within the professional sports world, which I still deal with in the NWSL, the athletes and the fans might be way out front, and you still are working with a side that might not be quite where you are. And whether that's their various forms of privilege or just lack of willingness to try to understand. But I am very encouraged that there's somebody like Jerry Jones, because that makes DeMaurice Smith's job way easier. If those billionaire white males are coming along and helping advocate for athletes doing whatever they want to do in forms of protest.
All right, this is probably dangerous at 10:05 to raise this question, but we have a couple on there. Nancy, we'll start with you, and then Becca will ask how soccer handles it. But issues associated with trans athletes in sport, at whatever level, at the Olympic level, in rugby, or at the high school level, as we've seen in the United States. Can you say a bit about where those issues are, and as a front for activism, and where it may be going?
Not where it needs to be, that's for sure. I think we've seen two very different prongs with the same group, and I'll refer to the International Olympic Committee and the Olympics. Some of their federations are actually pretty proactive. In fact, cycling, the International Cycling Union came up with a list of protocols that trans athletes had to meet in order to be eligible to compete. They're still pretty strict, but they basically dragged things like the X Games and other non-Olympic type groups along, because they had set these standards. But then you see something like track and field, which Roger, you are very familiar with it. And I use, basically I always defer to you, whatever you think on this issue, but they're using junk science to punish and discriminate against Caster Semenya. The rules were written specifically for her or specifically against her. So I think that's kind of the next frontier is that, it's all organizations are going to have to deal with it, and they should deal with it. We just had a NWSL player, she's Canadian, just came out as a trans athlete the other day. She participated in the Olympics, she participated in the World Cups. Trans athletes are at the heart of it, they're no different than other athletes. And we need to come up with policies, protocols, whatever you want to call them, to ensure that they have the same right to compete as everybody else, because that's just fair.
Becca, how's U.S. Soccer and then your Players Association? What are their views on this particular topic?
Honestly, we haven't even developed views, and I think this is almost a shame on us. I don't think there's any. It just hasn't been an issue that we've yet had to deal with, and I say had to deal with in a way that is more like we should already be dealing with it proactively. Rebecca Quinn is the athlete that Nancy was just referencing, Canadian Olympic player, plays for OL Reign and National Women's Soccer League, and she came out as publicly as trans yesterday. And look, trans athletes are athletes. They're humans, and I think this is not just an athlete issue. This is a general society issue for trans or anybody along the spectrum for gender identity. And we as a society have a lot of work to do, and all that extends over into the sports world generally, but also to soccer and women's soccer as well.
All right, we're getting up against the end here, and I'm at the end of my questions. So Nancy, maybe we'll start with you for any closing comments, and also include in those, let people know how they can find your reporting in your columns, which are outstanding, and how they find you on Twitter. Nancy's great and a fount of knowledge, obviously, for these issues. So Nancy, some last comments.
Sure. I think this is a really exciting time for our society, and I hate to use the word exciting because it's the result of such horrific and painful incidents. But I think we're going to look back at this as a time that we took another big step toward equality, one that is long overdue, but hopefully this leads to lasting change. I think Becca said that sports reflect our society, and I often say that sports are the prism through which we view society. They're not perfect. They do often trail, but if you look at Jackie Robinson, that was a big inspiration or big motivation for desegregation. Billie Jean King, equal rights movement followed. Even, you look at Magic Johnson declaring, letting or going public with his HIV diagnosis. It changed the way that we looked at HIV and AIDS. So when we see athletes advocate for social justice, when we see them tell their stories, hopefully it opens some hearts and minds, and that will have an impact for us over the next, 10, 20, 30 years. It's, like I said, it's an exciting time, and I feel very privileged to have a platform to be able to address issues like this. The rest of the world doesn't always agree with me, as my emails and my Twitter comments indicate, but whatever. This is the way that history is going. So, and as far as getting a hold of me or seeing what I write, our website is www.usatoday.com/sports. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at NRArmor. I also have a Facebook page. I think it's by Nancy Armour. I don't really interact on that. Twitter and Instagram are more where I do that.
Yeah, give her a follow. She's you can learn a lot. Becca, last comments.
I agree. Nancy is one of my favorite follows, so highly recommend. My comments are going to be more just on the onus of all of us as individuals. I think athletes, and Nancy just gave a great history of the specific athletes that have had dramatic impacts on how our society has shifted towards, I think, a more egalitarian place. But that's really on all of us. And so we are at a time where we're getting close to our next election, and it's not just about the national election, but it's also about your local ones. And wherever you fall on the political spectrum, you have I think we all as citizens have a duty to be active, and you should take a responsibility on yourself to whatever is inspiring you, whether it's an athlete or some other influencer or celebrity or your parents or your siblings. Somebody take that and put the onus on yourself to be better. And I am thankful to work with athletes that do that not only on the pitch every day, but also in other aspects of their life. And I'm not so active on social media, so I'm at Becca Rue, both Instagram and Twitter. I have a very, very poor presence on social media, but I would recommend that you follow all of our actual players. I let them be our voice, and we have our Players Association also has an account at USWNT Players on both platforms. Also less active because we don't have anybody doing any social media right now. One day we will hire for that. So stay tuned for some job postings. But
you mentioned Caitlin Murray's book. Which of the current players do you think people should follow to stay on top of social justice issues and so on?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, besides the ones that we mentioned, Megan Rapinoe, Becky Sauerbrunn, Kristen Press, Midge Purse, Crystal Dunn, Jessica McDonald, Adie French, Julie Ertz. There's several players. I think I'm a white woman speaking about race right now, and that has been a big focus recently, but there are a lot of players that deserve a voice. And I'll also say, Nancy, go look at Nancy's follows with her media. I was remiss to not mention how much media plays a role in amplifying athletes' voices. And there are so many incredible women. There's just a cadre of women reporters that are, I think Nancy would call them your colleagues maybe, but
yep.
You guys you talk amongst each other on Twitter, and that's what helps amplify not only the athletes' conversation, but broader society's conversation, and frankly, their own voices, because they have incredible things to say.
I'd also point out Kelly O'Hara.
Oh yes, Kelly.
Yes, it's really good. And Julie Foudy, who is now with ESPN, but former national team player. Not the water girl as she likes to call herself, but she's got a great podcast called Laughter Permitted that is really, really good. And the episode that she did, I think, when she was talking with Crystal Dunn and Jess McDonald on being a Black woman in soccer was really, really powerful. And I'd recommend you listen to all of Julie's episodes, but that one in particular I thought was really, really good.
Julie Foudy is one of my favorite people on this planet. She is also now an Angel City owner, but she is a fantastic follow, and her podcast is great.
Well, let me say, as we get near the end here, I'm sorry we didn't have Nick Ford able to join us, but on the positive side, that gave us more time with Becca and Nancy, which I think was great to get in a little deeper on these issues. So for the audience, why don't you join me in thanking, applauding, knocking on the table our guests. Thanks, Becca and Nancy, for spending time with us today. And in closing, thank you for watching today. Linked in the YouTube chat, and after you close the Zoom session, we invite you to participate in a short survey. Additionally, preparations are already underway for Conference of World Affairs 2021. Let's hope it happens in 2021. And the Conference of World Affairs relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the Conference of World Affairs. You can go to www.colorado.edu/CWA. Thanks, everybody. Be well, and see you next time.